Good afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming. As Director of the International Finance and Economic Policy Concentration at SIPA, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this 2011 Spring Distinguished Speaker Series in International Economics. At this school, we are intensely focused on the structural changes that have occurred in the global economy and the increased importance to global growth of the emerging economies of China, Brazil, India, and others, and of course the relative slow growth of the OECD economies. This is a profound change in the global economy, and one with significant and many different implications. These structural changes are occurring in an environment of heightened uncertainty following the global financial and economic crisis. And while there has been much improvement since 2009, I think there's still a lot to be concerned about. Europe's sovereign debt situation, the U.S., while things look significantly better by some measures, the room for policy maneuverability looks limited, unemployment rates are high, and the fiscal situation does not yet look like it's on a path to resolution. Although I should note that just this week, Secretary Geithner, in a talk in New York City, made one of the best cases that I have heard to argue that the global risks to recovery are manageable. But it is a period when even optimists like myself can feel gloomy. But on the other hand, we look to growth in China, and things are looking quite robust. And increasingly, firms and policymakers are looking to Chinese leaders and the economy to play a key role in sustaining global growth. But of course, China has its own significant economic challenges, be it as a result of inflationary pressures, the challenges of maintaining growth and employment, and addressing many obvious internal economic bottlenecks. Now, the IMF and the G20 are playing an important role in what international coordination is occurring, and a much stepped-up role since the crisis. But I think this period has also revealed the limited appetite that governments seem to have for policy coordination, and the limited rules and instruments that are actually in place at the international level to coordinate macro and financial policies. Although Basel III certainly goes quite far on certain rules regarding liquidity and capital for financial institutions. We are honored today to have two leading economists with us who can offer their unique and experienced perspectives on the global economy. You have their bios, and I will be brief. Dr. Zhu Min was to be with us, and he valiantly got on a plane this morning at 11:30 a.m. In Washington, and I have heard that they left the gate just a short while ago. He very much regrets and has been texting us repeatedly about his situation, but he really has been trying to get here all day, and unfortunately, he just can't be with us. But I'm very pleased that Dr. Jacob Frenkel and, of course, our own Professor Stiglitz are with us. Dr. Frenkel is chairman of JPMorgan Chase International and also chairman of the Group of 30. He has served as governor of the Bank of Israel for 2 terms and various senior posts at the IMF. Early in his career, he taught economics at the University of Chicago and is the recipient of many awards, including the 2002 Israel Prize in Economics. Our own Professor Stiglitz is, of course, a university professor at Columbia University and chair of the university's Committee on Global Thought. He's the 2001 recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he was a lead author in the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which group shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He previously served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and chief economist of the World Bank, and he continues as an extraordinarily prolific author and speaker with his most recent book, Free Fall, in 2010. I think almost every student in this room has taken or is hoping to take a course with Professor Stiglitz. So with that, if I may please invite Dr. Frenkel to start us off, Professor Stiglitz to follow, and then we'll have a brief exchange and open it up for discussion with all of you. I should warn you that we will need to leave promptly by 6:20, but at that time I think we have quite a lovely buffet outside, which I hope you will enjoy after our discussion. So with that, Dr. Frenkel.
Thank you very much. Since I'm going to start with the PowerPoint, I need some technical assistance. Can you put it on? While this is going on, let me just tell you that I'm delighted to be here today, and it brings a lot of memories. When some of you were still in the cradle in the early 70s, I spent some time at the Columbia University, and it's a delight to be here. I was told that I'm the opening speaker, and I was also told that I have about 15 minutes to give an opening remarks. And those 15 minutes will indeed be devoted to, can you raise the volume somehow?
Yeah.
Somebody's in charge? I know. The issue is not if I hear myself. So when I was told that I have 15 minutes to present 6 issues that are occupying us, I asked Professor Janow and everyone else, how can one make a presentation in 15 minutes and encompass the range of issues of the world? And it reminds me of the story of Bernard Shaw. You know, Bernard Shaw was very sniding on his competitors, and one day he introduced a colleague of his who he did not respect too much, and said, and Mr. X will give us all of what he knows about the world in 15 minutes. And Mr. X said, Mr. Shaw, I'm not sure I can make it in 15 minutes. And Bernard Shaw is allegedly told him, in such a case, try to speak slowly. There are really 6 issues today that cover the global economy. I will not address each one of them in any details, but at least I will invite for questions or discussion on them as we move along. Of course, we are in 2011. We are still under the impression of the financial markets. Financial markets 2-3 years ago sounded like the floor is going to disappear from underneath us. The reality is that both in emerging markets and in the industrial world, the equity indices have, quotation mark, returned to approximately, have recovered somewhat. Of course, there is a big difference between emerging markets and industrial economies, and that difference is one of the key developments that a Martian that visited us a decade ago would find the most extraordinary phenomenon. In fact, the measure of recovery, if you want to look at it in terms of an integrated system, is in terms of the renewal of equity portfolio flows to emerging economies. There was a year, which was about 2 years ago, when actually this magnitude was negative, which meant that the most important or a very important engine of economic development has been curtailed when it has reversed itself. Second issue is the real economic system. Again, if you look 2 years ago, 2009, the world economy has shrunk. It has shrunk, of course, in a different way, industrial economies, developing economies, but it has shrunk. Like always, averages mask great diversities. We see that 2010 and 2011, those are the numbers that were presented to ministers and governors last week in Washington, show that the world is resuming its growth. Those of you who will need to leave the room in 5 minutes, I want to make sure that you don't get the impression that all is fine. Because one of the dangers is that we will see these numbers and say, well, it's beautiful, we can move on as we were. So we'll come back to unearth some of these issues. And indeed, the first phenomenon, which I already mentioned, is the fundamentally different performance of emerging economies or developing economies and advanced or industrial countries. We see that for both groups, growth is resuming, but emerging economies are growing at a significantly higher pace than the industrial countries. And in fact, if you look at the change from 2009 and 2010, it is 6.4 percentage point reversal. But yet again, the action, as I will conclude the remarks today, is happening in the developing world. In fact, the major countries in the industrial world have shrunk for practically everyone in 2009 and have recovered, albeit in a slow pace. And the same pattern with much more dramatic numbers is for the developing countries. The key message that our guy from Mars will bring back from his visit here, you know, he was here about 20 years ago. When he came back in 1990, he reported that the world is very stable. We have some plans that somehow in a decade the euro might be created. In 1990, this was the story. Japan is a very important locomotive. China and India are under the radar screen. In fact, together, they produce 7% of world GDP, so defined. Fast forward 20 years, and China and India have produced about 20 or 19% of world GDP. And of course, Japan on the one hand, Europe on the other, have reduced significantly their relative share. I want you to note, those of you who are familiar with pie charts of that type will notice that those numbers are not likely to change so rapidly, and what we see here is a very dramatic change. The third building block has to do with trade, China, and imbalances. I want you to know, again, those who may need to leave soon, I'm not going to be engaged at all in China bashing, in spite of the fact that many think that that's the point. I really think it's the wrong approach. So I'm going to say something about this. First, economic activity and trade growth are two sides of the same coins. And you can see again that in 2009, in fact, trade shrunk significantly, which was the mechanism by which the global recession spread itself. 2010 to 11 show significant recovery there. But remember that everyone who was traveling around heard that both in Europe and in the US, everyone was pointing at the dangers that come from China. Please look at the block that connects European Union and the US on the one hand and China on the other. What you can see is that during that period, China imported from the US and Europe about $300 billion and exported to this group about 644. That gap explains much of, or instead of saying explain, accounts for much of the public debate about, is China a threat? The Chinese argue, and correctly so, that in a world in which trade is to be accounted for in a multilateral setting, it is a big mistake to think about it in a bilateral setting. And in fact, if you look just at the three blocks, US, Europe, China, and the rest of Asia, you can see that in fact when it comes to the rest of Asia, China is importing from there more than what it exports, which gives us a hint about the production chain and the trading chain that reflects it. China is importing raw materials and whatever it is from the rest of Asia, repackages it, adds something, and sells it further to the US and Europe. And if the US and Europe were to import significantly less from China, China will need to import significantly less from the rest of Asia, which means an implosion. That's the last thing that we want. So the point of the matter is that when we look at China and the relationship, we need to put it in the broader context. And I'll come back to it in a moment, except to say that while policymakers were screaming and raising hell about the Chinese exchange rate and the like, in the meanwhile, businessmen have recognized opportunities. And in fact, whereas in 2000, the year 2000, the entire European exports to China was about 5% of European exports, today it's 20%, a very rapid change in the trading pattern. Whereas in the year 2000, only 3% of US exports went to China. Today, closer to 20%. In other words, the business community recognizes opportunities when they are there. So where is the problem in the global setting? The issue is that we still have significant magnitudes of imbalances. And here the US is a very important component of it. Whereas the US in this year is forecasted to have a deficit in the current account of about $500 billion, the rest of China, Japan, and the oil exporting countries are having this very large export. Well, in principle, you should not worry about the fact that some country is having an accumulation of assets and some decumulate assets, unless you recognize that this phenomenon has been with us now for a very long period, which means the US is fundamentally spending more than what it earns, and therefore has a very low saving rate, whereas the rest of the world, and in particular Asia, is the saving block. Of course, if it goes year in and year out, there is a huge transfer of wealth internationally, and indeed, today, China is holding already more than $3 trillion worth of reserves. Most of it got accumulated during the past 5 years. So the concern is not so much with the fact that there is a deficit, but rather that it is continuing and maybe not sustainable. Where is the fundamental imbalance? The fundamental imbalance, and that's the last slide on this chapter, is reflected by the fact that the US is a very low saving country. Only about 10% of each dollar produced is being saved. China is a very high saving country, about 50% of each dollar is being saved. So don't be surprised that the saving country imports assets from the dis-saving country. The solution to it, and here we will not discuss it in my presentation, but I can say much of the debate, the polemic debate, was just change the exchange rate. But you should recognize that this cannot be the solution. It can be a component of the solution, but not the solution. As long as this gap exists, as long as China is a high saving country, China will import assets from the rest of the world compared to, relatively speaking. So if you really are worried about it, for example, if the US is worrying about it, instead of sending the Secretary of the Treasury sequence of them, one after the other, to come back with a frustration because they want to change the exchange rate, you should really go and design a win-win strategy. And the win-win strategies come, for example, to the Chinese and ask them, why do you save so much? And they will tell you, because we are responsible people. Because we don't have yet a social security system that is operating. We don't have yet a pension system that is operating. We don't have yet good capital markets that allows our companies to pay dividends in a normal way. We still have maybe the one-child policy on the book somewhere. So we must self-insure by saving ourselves. Okay, here is the opening. Then come to them and say, let me help redesign with you the capital market so that you will not need to save so much to secure the same secure future. Develop your social security system, pension system, capital markets, dividends, whatever. The only thing we cannot do is tell them how many children to have. And I think that's really a much less antagonistic approach. What are the macro challenges? Here I will say next to nothing except to say that you all know about it. Monetary policy, fundamentally speaking, ran out of ammunition. In the sense that interest rates all over the world are close to zero. Balance sheets of central banks have expanded in order to provide liquidity to the market. In fact, the Fed and the UK are now having 300% increase in the size of the balance sheet compared with what it just was not long ago. Europe is also somewhere there, but in a much less significant way. All of you heard yesterday the declaration practically that the QE2 is not going to be followed likely by QE3, but still there is an issue of monetary policy. It is against the background that fiscal policy has its hands tied. Budget deficits all over the world, whether it is industrial countries or developing countries, are very large. So even though the deficit is reduced, is about to be reduced, it is forecasted to be this year about 10% both in Japan and in the US. And of course, when it happens year in and year out, public debt is rising significantly. So this brings us to Europe, because in Europe, everyone says that there is a crisis, and the crisis reflects debt. Remember where we were in 1990 when this Martian came here. He read that there is a plan to introduce a new currency, and that this plan is not a simple one, because the countries that join the euro will need to give up independent monetary policy. They will only have one currency. Give up exchange rate policy. So what is left is fiscal policy. And how can we ensure that the interests of the members coincide with each other so as to have a single policy instrument? And the answer was, let's design convergence strategy. And over a full decade of the 90s, they all went into the convergence strategy that was supposed to be concluded by the so-called numbers designed in Maastricht. Maastricht is the name of a city in the Netherlands before it became the name of a treaty. And the idea was that budget deficits across the board should not exceed a number that they had, 3%. Debt to GDP will not exceed a number that they had, 60%. Doesn't matter. The point is convergence. The reality is that this was against a background which is showing the great diversity and therefore the intrinsic difference in interest of the components. Unemployment rates across the countries is hugely different. Whereas in Spain it's over 20%, in Greece 15%, Portugal 11%, Germany 7%. So obviously you have countries with different potential needs. Then you go to competitiveness and you notice that since the creation of since the last few years, productivity trends were very different. Whereas Germany, unit labor cost declined, in other countries it increased, and obviously if something was in equilibrium at the beginning of the journey, it is dramatically out of equilibrium at the end of the journey. And as a result, you have had a very significant divergences in fiscal state positions, accompanied with very large and rapid rise in debt. And in fact, we now have a situation that public debt in the marketplace is perceived as being more dangerous and risky than corporate debt in the same marketplace. In fact, the credit default swaps, as we call it, is wider for some of the sovereigns than for the corporate, something which is our friend from Mars will never recognize, because the concept was that there is nothing safer than the country, and the company is at best as safe as the country, but normally less so. What was the issue? Remember that we spoke about a China-US difference in savings. Same story happened in Europe. They put so much energy in reaching convergence that they had no more energy left to implement the morning after. And indeed, some decided to give a big party, lower their savings, and of course, run the very large deficit, and some decided to raise their savings. So whereas Germany in that decade raised its savings, Portugal, Greece, etc., have lowered their savings very dramatically. Well, this means that imbalances arose, and you had in Germany large surplus, which was matched by very large deficit in the other peripheral countries. And when the Europeans go around and say, we are not contributing to world imbalance because on the whole, Europe is relatively balanced, it is a correct statement, but irrelevant for the understanding of the internal tensions that can follow from the very large diversity. And indeed, those countries, the government debt of these countries are showing in the market very, very different spreads. If Greece's spread today is about 1,000 basis points above the benchmark, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, very large diversity. No wonder that some countries will not greet very favorably the proposal of issuing a pan-European bond, because we know who will subsidize whom in this transaction. Our friend from Mars, who doesn't have a microscope, only has telescope. So he says, you know what, don't bother me with the details of CDS and small, minute things. I want to look at big trends. I want just to plot a picture of what is the relationship between gross government debt and budget deficits. And I'll take a snapshot of 2011 and just have all the countries that I want to look at plotted there. And then he says, wow, my God, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Greece are seeming to be a little outlier. Maybe they have something in common. Of course, with a wink in his eye, he will also say US and UK are also there. But he says, today we are analyzing Europe, so let's not make a circle around them, but keep it in mind. Then he says, let me look at different statistics. Current account balance and the budget deficit. And again, those countries with very large deficit in the current account and large budget deficit are clustered somewhere. Again, we see Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Greece. US and UK are not hiding, but they are there. Then you say, well, let me look at savings. Those countries with very low saving rates and large budget deficits, again, are clustered in that area. They say, well, maybe the handwriting was on the wall much before the credit default swaps showed it, and much before S&P did this or that, because there are really fundamental trends there. And finally, and here I will just throw two words and leave the floor, our friend from Mars says, I want to come again here in 20 years. What world will I meet? And what is the challenge from that world? And we will see that between now and the year, in 20 years from now, the world will have a larger population than what it has now by about 1.4 billion people. The interesting part about it is the age distribution. As you can see, by and large it looks a little bit Gaussian, although there is some tendency for aging. The group that has The largest addition is the group of age 60 to 69. But that's a nice distribution. But let's not be misled. He knows that the world is not homogeneous. And in fact, when he looks at the developing countries, he sees that from the 1.4 billion additions to the world, almost 1.35 are all in the developing countries. Only a tiny 45 million people are added to the industrial countries, and most of them are in the US, by the way. But look how they are divided. They are aging. The world of the industrial countries is aging. If you want to see more friends in 20 years, you better be 60 and above. The other cohorts are shrinking. And then he said, well, you all told me that America is a great country. Well, it is. In fact, most of the additions to the industrial world happen to be in America. You can see here the baby boomers and all the rest. Europe is indeed shrinking and aging. And a guy from Mars says, if you come from Washington and don't take a train, we are amazing that you arrive in time. You must be from China. So in a quick tour, you saw that Europe is shrinking. Japan, my goodness, you must be 80 plus to see more friends around you in 20 years. China is expanding, but aging badly. India is expanding in a nice Gaussian place. So to make the story short, he already comes back and says, when I come back next time, I'm going really to visit China and India and the emerging countries, because that's where the action is. And then he's being told, by the way, didn't you forget Africa? He says, Africa? I never knew that there is a country there except that China wants to buy the natural resources from there. No, I'm teasing now. The reality is, Africa is the most important challenge today because it has a huge opportunity. And the next picture will give you everything that you need to know about it. Africa will have an addition of 490 million people in the next 20 years if they survive the health challenges. And primarily young. The population is going to get younger and younger, which is the key for dynamic, innovative society. It's completely under the radar screen, maybe because people don't believe that this large high birth rate will indeed translate itself in high population, but whatever it is, I'm sure that our friend from Mars will come back in 20 years to Africa. So thank you very much. I thought we had more time, but now that I have consumed part of the time, I'm delighted to see you, Minju. Thank you. I'm going to sit down.
Why don't we move up here, since I think we don't have PowerPoints, and Dr. Zhu has been traveling all day to be with us and has finally been able to get here. So thank you. Let's give him a round of applause.
So let me try to be unusually brief, so not to use up all the time. I'm going to try to complement what Jacob has said and focus disproportionately on the United States and the weaknesses, but then talk a little bit about the global challenges. The characteristic that Jacob depicted is obviously is correct, that we have a very divided world, one where Europe and America are doing very poorly, and Asia, emerging markets more generally, Latin America, even Africa are doing very well. The nature of the doldrums in which the United States is today is illustrated by the growth numbers that just came out. for the United States the first quarter of 1.8%. Not exactly a stellar number. The depths of the problem are illustrated by the labor market, where it's still the case that close to 1 out of 6 Americans who would like a full-time job can't get one, that more than 40% of those who are unemployed have been unemployed for more than 6 months, where category after category, the unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate, is about twice what it was before the crisis. So yes, unemployment rate amongst college-educated people is much better than among those that are high school graduates, but it's still twice what it was before. And under certain youth unemployment is still around 20%, slightly less than 20%, but among certain social demographic groups, and the official unemployment rate is extraordinarily high. The nature of the problem was illustrated yesterday in Bernanke's press conference, where he pointed out that the number of jobs is about 7 million below what it was at the peak. But what he didn't point out is that in the interim, somewhere around 4 million Americans would normally have entered the labor market. So the jobs deficit is not the 7 million that he mentioned, but really more like 11 or 12 million. And we're just running to stand still. We're just creating a few more jobs than the new entrants into the labor force. If you look at the housing market, about 7 million Americans have lost their homes already. More would have lost their homes if the banks had been able to get their legal teams in order to, and had not made such a mess of the documentation, so that the limit is the ability to throw people out of the house legally, and that hasn't stopped them. Some of the time, they've thrown people out of the house illegally. And we expect about another 2 million to lose their home this year, and about a little bit less than that next year. So when you look across the picture of where the United States is, the forecast of the unemployment, the growth, is that we are nowhere near a real recovery, and not likely to be for not only this year, next year, probably the year after. One of the sources of the concern is the one that Jacob mentioned, the instruments for recovery. The policy tools are coming themselves to an end, are reaching problems. I've not been a big fan of QE2. It has clearly been extraordinarily controversial. What is clear is, in a global financial market, when you create liquidity, you can go anywhere in the world. And with the United States not performing well and the emerging markets performing so well, it's quite natural that the money has gone to the emerging markets, or has attempted to go to the emerging markets. They've responded by putting up all kinds of capital market interventions to prevent appreciations of their currency, prevent bubbles, and the irony is the United States, which has been one of the strongest advocates of global market financial integration, because of QE2, has actually been a major source of financial market disintegration, of setting up barriers to the free flow of capital. Now, if you're like me and think that probably is a good thing, you are less upset. But the irony is that these are people who really believed it was a good thing to have full capital market integration, and they brought down the change, a change very dramatic in the sense that just a couple of weeks ago, a couple reports came out of the IMF talking about the use of capital controls, or sometimes called capital account management techniques, to try to stabilize capital markets. A really dramatic change from the position that the IMF had in the past. Well, the irony, the question was yesterday again at the press conference. One of the questions Bernanke was asked is, if you think it was effective, and as I say, I don't think it was. Part of the reason it was not as effective as one would have hoped is that the credit channel, one of the main channels of monetary policy, for small and medium-sized enterprises, which is the source of all job creation, in most job creation in most economies, is still clogged. It's not. We really haven't repaired the small community banks, the medium-sized banks that are the source of credit for small and medium-sized enterprises. So it's not a surprise that it hasn't worked as effectively as some had hoped. But the Fed still believes it worked, and when he was asked, well, if you thought it worked, why didn't you do more of it? And what he suggested was perhaps worried about inflation. Well, for those of us who he didn't fully articulate what that meant, but it seemed to be saying that he believes that the natural rate of unemployment in the United States is over 8%. I hope that's not what he means, or it may have been just another form of intellectual incoherence. But in any case, it's a little bit disturbing that in many quarters there are some people who are beginning to think that we won't ever get back in anytime soon to the kinds of unemployment rates that we had before the crisis. I don't think this is just a structural problem. I do think that effective stimulus policies can not only bring down the unemployment rate, but prevent something that is a real risk, which is the phenomenon that was called hysteresis in the context of Europe in the 1980s and early 90s, that when you have extended periods of unemployment, like we're having in the United States, people lose their job skills, and the result of that is it becomes increasingly difficult to integrate them back into the labor force, and when they are integrated back in the labor force, it's at a much lower wage. So I think it is imperative that we take very strong actions, but monetary policy, I think, as Jacob was rightly said, has really come to the end of its, has very limited ability to change things. But that brings us to fiscal policy. The problem is that stimulus worked, but it was too small, and now has come to an end. The states and localities are have balanced budget frameworks where if their revenues go down, they have to cut back spending or raise taxes. The amounts are significant of their cutbacks, and that is also going to be depressing our economy, let alone having enormous social impacts. But finally, in Congress now, there seems to be serious commitments to a deficit reduction. Now, if it's done in the right way, which is out in the future, then that's one thing. But the real danger is the demand to reduce the deficit right now. Now, there are many ways that one could actually reduce the deficit even now and stimulate the economy, but those are not on the agenda. That is to say, for instance, if you increase taxes at the top and reduce taxes at the bottom, because the propensities to spend are higher at the bottom than they are at the top, that kind of change in the distribution of tax burden actually stimulates the economy and can lower the deficit. But I haven't heard that as a major point in the attacking of the deficits on either party. But we should remember in the discussion of the deficit that in 2000, before Bush undertook the tax cuts, we had a 2% of GDP surplus. It's one of the most dramatic changes in fiscal situation caused by poorly designed tax cuts. And in a way, reversing that tax cut, undoing the provision in the Medicare Part D that said that U.S. government couldn't negotiate with the drug companies, even though we're the largest buyer in the world, and undoing the wars that began under the Bush administration. That plus one more thing would actually do a great deal to reduce the deficit, and that one more thing is putting America back to work, solving the problem of unemployment. Most of the deficit that we have today is caused by the fact that our economy is performing well below norm. Because I have just a limited amount of time, let me just make 2 or 3 more random remarks and then sit down. The first remark I want to make is, in terms of Europe, it clearly is going to be going through some very difficult times. The Euro project was an unfinished project. As Jacob said, it took away 2 instruments, interest rate and exchange rate mechanisms for adjustment, but didn't put into place what needed to be put in place. And the fundamental mistake is one that they still haven't come to terms with. They thought that all you had to do for getting a framework that would work is to have fiscal convergence. That is to say, get down the deficits. But that was nonsense, and that should have been known to be nonsense. Spain and Ireland had surpluses before the crisis. So you can't blame their current situation on the lack of failing to comply with the Maastricht Convention or lack of responsibility. There was one mistake they made, the same mistake that the United States made. They deregulated financial markets, and they allowed this flow of capital to come in to cause real estate booms, which, when they broke, left devastation in their wake. So it was, in a way, similar to the United States. It was the deregulation combined with the integration that made it easier for capital to flow very quickly from one country to the other. Unless, the big lesson for the United States, big lesson for Europe is, unless you restructure debts, they're going to weigh down. That's the legacy that we face in the United States. That's the legacy in Europe, particularly in countries like Ireland. And that unless the restructuring occurs, the legacy of debt is going to be is going to make restoration to prosperity very difficult. Finally, let me just say a word about the global framework. Before the crisis, there was discussion, Bernanke talked about what was called a savings glut. It was an attempt to shift blame to China for the global imbalances. It used to be that savings was a virtue. Suddenly, savings have become a vice. But the problem wasn't really, let's be clear, this crisis was not caused by these global imbalances. It was caused by the failure of the United States to regulate its financial markets adequately. The global imbalances are a problem. They could cause the next crisis. But the issue isn't a question, I think, of savings glut. As I look around the world, I look to Africa and the statistics that Jacob talked about, the growth of the population. There's an enormous need for investment to increase the productivity of those in Africa. Enormous need for investments in North Africa, a major problem of youth unemployment in North Africa. The problem of global warming is going to require very large investments to retrofit the global economy to have a more green economy. So as I look around the world, I don't see a problem of savings glut. I mean, the word almost I find objectionable. The real problem was, again, a failure of global financial markets. The failure of the global financial markets was that they didn't take the savings that was available and use it in a socially productive way. They used it in a very socially unproductive way, where some of the houses that were constructed are already being gutted. So it reminds us that markets don't always work well, and trying to assume that they do is a recipe for disaster. So with that, let me just conclude that with the observation that because we haven't really addressed some of these underlying problems of restructuring, haven't really adequately addressed the problem of re-regulating the markets in the way that they ought to be, prospects for a robust recovery this year or even next year within the United States and Europe, I think, remain bleak.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think, Dr. Zhu, I want to thank you again for coming. Jacob Frenkel gave us a broad sweep perspective on the global economy, and we've had a chance to hear Professor Stiglitz, and I think invite you to give your perspectives.
Oh, thank you, Professor Janow, for the invitation. It's a great honor for me to speak to this very distinguished audience, and particularly share the podium with Joe and Jacob. Joe and Jacob are my mentors. I always learn great deal from them. So it is a great honor for me to be here. I'm sorry being late. I stayed in the airport for 3 hours, queuing 4 times, changed the flight 5 times.
Oh my God.
And finally, I get into the airplane and stay there for 2 hours. Thanks for God, we have air conditioning. But it's only take like 40 minutes come to here. And grab a cab, and I landed at 5:10, and the cab drive me, wow, like fly, and 15 minutes I'm here. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
If you have the high-speed trains that you had in China, how long would it take you?
Now that will make a difference, that's true, 45 minutes. And also, sorry again, I even don't have a tie. I feel very uncomfortable. And, but I'm going to talk some very serious stuff, though, although I have no tie at all. I understand Jacob gave a whole picture about the global situations, and Joe talked about U.S. economic policy. So I'm talking about emerging market. I'm talking about the global economic structure changing, and the changing structure impose the challenge for emerging market particularly. I'm not going to talk about advanced economy. I think this is Joe's job and the others. The world is changing. The changing started with 2-speed recovery in particularly economic recovery periods after financial crisis. I would say after 100 years, anyone will write history about the financial crisis recovery, they will say the most important issue is a 2-speed recovery. Last year, the world had 5% GDP growth rates, advanced economy 3%, emerging markets 6.5%. This year, the world have 4.4% GDP growth rates, advanced economy 2.5%, emerging market, again, 6.1%. As a consequence of this 2-speed recovery, first time last year, the emerging market contributed more than 70% of global GDP growth. It's the first time emerging market and advanced economy contributed more than 73% of global consumption growth. The total demand side changes. It's the first time last year the emerging market and the developing country account for 47.8% of PPP based of global GDP. In a few years, in a few months, the advanced economy and the emerging market will share the global GDP half and half. It's the first time in human economic history, particularly in the past 300 and 400 years. Why that change economic structure will change economic situation? The fundamental under this changing is when the growth gravity moving away from west to east is moving away from 1 billion population to 3 billion population. That's changing the whole thing. Today, 1 billion people live in the advanced economy, and 3 billion people live in the emerging market. When the 1 billion people have very low growth rates, very weak economically, historically, and an emerging market has a very strong growth with its 3 billion population. It's changed the whole thing. Given the time limitation, let me point the 3 I would think most important change because of the changing of the growth pattern. The first issue is we observed already, we will observe the further the shifting on demand on the commodity and energy. We observed the demand for the commodity energy really increased and shifting away from advanced economy to the emerging market, but changing will be even bigger. 10 years ago, the world total consumption for oil is 28.1 billion barrels. Among 28.1 billion barrels, actually 17.1 billion consumed by advanced economy, emerging market consume only 11 billion. 10 years later, end of last year, the world consumed 31.9 billion barrel oil. Among its 31.9 billion, 16.5 billion consumed by advanced economy. Downside, emerging market increased 15%, become 15.3 billion barrel of oil. In 5 years later, 2015, the world we forecast will consume roughly 34.6 billion barrel oil. Among them, the advanced economy will consume 16.5 to 6, roughly the same. Emerging market will consume more than 17.8 billion barrel of oil. Copper. Copper is a classical commodity, go almost parallel with per capita income increase. 10 years ago, the world consumed total copper is 15.8 million ton. Among the 15.8 million ton copper, advanced economy consumed 12.4 million tons. Emerging market consumed roughly 4 million tons, less than that. 10 years later, end of last year, the world total consumption for copper was 19.5 million tons. Among them, the advanced economy consumed only 7.6 million tons, and the emerging market consumed 11.9 million tons. More than doubled in 10 years. In the 5 years horizon 2015, we forecast the copper will increase quite a bit, 33.8 million tons. Among them, advanced economy consumption will roughly stay 8.3 million tons, more or less the same. Emerging market consume 25.4 million ton copper. Why copper? Because copper is a classical commodity, go parallel with the consumption increase. When the people's consumption, think about it, it's 3 billion people. If every household need a refrigerator, need a TV, and need a housing, need a car, how much copper they need? So that's the whole thing changed. In the past 15 to 20 years, we see 3 different drive forces pushing the commodity consumptions, the overall and all structurally. The first drive force behind the whole thing is a global manufacturing repositioning. Manufacturing globalization moved a lot of low-factor manufacturing away from the advanced economy to the emerging market. Obviously, emerging market consume more commodity and energy, but it is just a global consumption relocation. It does not add to the incremental consumption for the whole thing. But the second thing happened. When the emerging market has more manufacturing capacity, they invest a lot of things in infrastructures. When the infrastructure in the emerging market increase, they demand more commodity and energy as well. That's become the whole incremental part of the consumption for the commodity energy in the past 15 and 20 years. Now we start to see the third wave. The third wave starts because the 3 billion people get rich, has more income, they will consume more. This is a classical historically, if we see Japan and Korea, even with the United States, see Germany cases, you always see manufacture to pick it up, consumption and the commodity pick it up in a certain very flat slope. When the personal consumption increases, you really see the slope of the consumption of the commodity pick it up. Now it's an income effect. So we will see that happen. I think that's the first quite a big change. The second change, I would say, fundamentally, is the global trade pattern change. Today, the emerging market is very much an export-driven model that exports a lot of things. But the first time we observed in the last year, the emerging market become the demand side rather than export side or supply side. In the whole Asia, the total aggregate demand increased roughly little bit less than 10%. The production total increase only roughly 8.1%. There's 2% different gap. And in the States, the aggregate consumption increase is slower than aggregate supply growth. When the emerging market per capita increase, they consume more, so they will import more rather than export more. So the trade pattern we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years what happens. Number one, actually, the emerging market will become major import force. Today we call it imbalancing. I will see will completely change in 10 years. Further, the trade will more broad among the developing country and the emerging market rather than from the south to north. Because if we're looking for the past 15 years, because WTO, the tariff barrier dropped dramatically between the south and the north. But within the south and the south, there's a lot of room to improve the trade. We observe that's picked up in the past 2 years. We expect to see the trade flow will getting ever stronger among the developing country and the emerging market. The global trade pattern will change. Let me point the last things will change. The global financial map will change. Emerging market and low-income countries, they account for roughly 47.8% of global GDP. PPP measures are mentioned, but they account only 19% of global financial assets. Money chasing growth. When the growth really becomes sustainable, picked up in emerging markets, we expect to see the money will follow. 20 years ago, most of the money moving away from the advanced economy to the emerging market are FDIs. Before the crisis, we see the FDI and the short-term liquidity capital flow move away. After crisis, particularly last year, first time we observed the portfolio, the financial capital flow picked up. The compensation of the capital flow moving away from the advanced economy to the emerging market picked up. It's a huge, huge issue. Assume 1% of pension fund in the United States moving into the emerging market, which account for roughly $480 billion, almost the whole size of a capital flow emerging market received today. They will maintain. And the so-called uphill capital flow today, the capital from the official emerging market to the advanced economy, particularly finance, the treasury, the government bonds, will slow down. Because the saving rates were coming down, consumption will pick it up, because the further deregulation and the further privatization going on in the emerging market. And official flow was smaller, and the capital flow moving here, private flow was stronger moving to the emerging market, and official flow moving from the emerging market to the advanced economy probably was smaller. Downhill, uphill capital flow structure will be very different. I think those changes will pose a daunting challenge for the world. But let me point the major challenge for emerging market per se. Given the time limitation, let me point the 3 major challenges I think is important for emerging market. The first issue I will say is the whole emerging market. I mean, there are a lot of short-term we talk about inflationary pressures, talk about overheating by whatever. I'm not going to talk about. I talk about fundamental structure change. Let me point out that things. And the first issue is how emerging market moving away from external demand-driven growth model to internal supply push growth model. I don't like to use the sort of internal consumption-driven, because consumption-driven is aggregate demand concept. For the mature economy, the Keynesian model says you have a demand, that everything follows up. But for the emerging market, the most important thing is how do you have a structure industry will keep moving up to the value chain and create wealth. Before, it's easier because 100% depends on external demand. When trade coming in, it's just moving labor from non-tradable to tradable. When the the demand change, from whatever, the bottles, the glasses to iPad, so your industry structure moving, follow the trade pattern. So it's very much not only the aggregate demand, but also structure of domestic economy depends on external demand. But now it's gone because there's no external demand. Or the external demand become much, much weaker. It is not the total aggregate demand issue. It's a structure issue. In the past 2 years, we observe emerging market use the stimulus package to substitute the dropping external demand from the advanced economy. So that's the reason they maintain very strong growth, works very well, but it's not sustainable because the physical buffer is much smaller, much thin today. You cannot keep a stimuli to push the aggregate demand. You have to think about how do you moving from the supply side, from structure side, to move the whole industry to the value chain, create more wealth and more value, which is not easy. Korea and the Japanese case says, number one, you have to have an industry policy. You need a policy to guide the structure change because the structure change will not happen automatically. Korea and the Japan's case also says that any industry policy you take, you run into the policy risk. A risk is huge. Emerging markets have to run your own show now. How do you create the R&D, create the incentive for the creative things? How do you create the institution? Make sure the whole industry structurally move into the upper value chain. I think this is a much bigger challenge than we call the domestic consumption-driven growth model, because it's very simple aggregate demand side concept. I think that's easy. It's really supply chain. I think that's a very big challenge. And the history haven't provided a very good successful case yet. The second thing, there are a few things I would say. There are so many things I think the emerging market facing daunting challenge today. But I would say, if the second thing is, there will be, I will pick between, think about between the energy efficiency and fiscal or financial sector reform. Let me say the fiscal and financial sector reform. If you're looking for the statistics, since the year 2007 to 2010, advanced economy government debts increased from 72 to 94, increased 22% of our GDP. Emerging market stayed 36% of GDP, same. In the next five years, in 2010s, the advanced economies, the total government debts will increase another 10% of GDP point to 106. The government debts for emerging markets were down from current 36% to 30%. That's great news. It is great news. But you have to take into consideration that emerging markets do not have a pension system, do not have a healthcare system. I think it's time for the emerging market to build a whole system, social safety nets, given they still have a growth, they still have money, given a lot of lessons we learned during the crisis from the advanced economies. I think this is a daunting challenge, how to build a financial market and to absorb all this huge capital flow, they are coming. Nothing will stop this money moving to the emerging market. What we observe, for example, in the last 18 months, all the capitals is really short dollar, long stock, and a long sort of a proxy of emerging market. Now we start to see the capital long on emerging market directly, not the proxy of the emerging market. So it's daunting. But I would say the last, I think not least obvious, the most important challenge for the emerging market is to find a new life model. It sounds very funny. Why life model? If you go to China, ask everyone Chinese, what is your dream life model? People will say American model. Big house, big car, 4x4 UVS, you know. New York to Washington, you need to take a flight and not train. But the crisis tells us, if 3 billion people shooting for the same model, the planet will not be able to afford that one. So the emerging market have to create a new lifestyle model for themselves. I mean, it's become so clear. There's a 1.3 billion people in China. I always say, if 1.3 billion people, everyone takes shower before they go to bed, we're in trouble. Yeah, 50 years ago, people in Kansas City may not take shower, go to bed, right? But they do today. You know, in New York particularly, people take so forgiven, right? You take shower, go to bed. Otherwise, you come from barbarians. But you think about that. So really the whole thing, I mean, it's the crisis tells us the European model, maybe American life model, not necessarily a sustainable model in terms of economic, financial, and resource and energy consumption. So for the 3 billion people, we need a new model, and which is also a daunting challenge as well. I think I overeaten my times already. If I can conclude, I would say the world is changing. World will continue to change. The challenge for the whole world, particularly for the emerging market, is daunting, because there's nothing guaranteed emerging market will be overcome all those challenges to make the growth sustainable. The world is changing. The direction is not all clear yet. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. We are out of time, and we can't have the kind of discussion that we need to have, and I wish we could have. But I can't have us leave without hearing at least a question or two from our students and our invited guests. So could I please have a microphone? I'd like us to just hear 1 or 2 questions and then invite our panel to give very disciplined replies of a minute each as you hear these questions. Could you raise your hand, please? And one question up front, and please identify yourself and a question, please.
This is Adam Quinton, and I'm a SIPA adjunct. Almost exactly 40 years ago, the then Secretary of the Treasury, John Connolly, told a delegation of Europeans that the US dollar was our currency, but your problem. And that seems a fair assessment of the de facto US policy today, the point being that the US dollar continues to hit new lows. And so far, the international response to that has essentially been a lot of angst, talk about currency wars, and as Professor Stiglitz said, capital controls to attempt to inhibit the flow of loose money coming out of the US. My question, in the light of all of that, is what risk does the panel see in further devaluation of the dollar being met ultimately by a more serious response by those affected countries, explicitly perhaps in the form of protectionism?
Let me collect a couple more questions. Yes. Perhaps a bit shorter questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your scholarship and your experiences with us today. My name is Haris Lipiridis. I'm a student here at SIPA. and I come from Greece, so my question is related with the Eurozone and Greece. The people of my country are facing dramatic and painful changes in their lives, following the directions of the IMF, the European Union, the European Central Bank. And no matter the fact that we understand that changes need to happen, we realize that the changes that we are doing, they don't have the expected outcomes. So considering the debate about the restructuring of some of the countries, some of the European Union countries' debt, one of which is Greece, I would like to ask our guests what is their opinion, and considering the fact that a restructure of the debt will have, and the implications of the restructure of the debt in the European Union in general and the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think, may I have a question over here, please?
Yeah, I'm a student here at Columbia University.
Please speak up.
My name is Li Wei Wang, and I'm a student at the engineering school at Columbia University. Dr. Jacob mentioned we need to have this kind of international cooperation between advanced economies, and especially in helping the Chinese or emerging markets on the capital markets build up. But it seems from Dr. Zhu's words, the advanced economy is not providing enough support for the emerging market to catch up, to provide this kind of supply. So do you see this kind of cooperation or conflict between the advanced economies and these emerging markets will sustain? What's the direction of this?
Thank you very much. One last question. In the far back, please.
Hüseyin Beyazıt, Senior Research Fellow with Columbia Business School, with the Dr. Frenkel. There is an increase in intra-regional trade blocks. Like, for example, Russia is now establishing ties with the ex-Soviet links, and also, for example, South Africa with China, and also Latin America. We see this the emerging or developing regions trade activities. Would you evaluate on its impact on global financial structure? And second thing, there is a crisis in terms of liquidity, tightness of capital in emerging markets for projects. And it also has direct implication on the growth of our middle class. And could you evaluate on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This gentleman has been waiting from the beginning. I'll give you one last word, if we can bring. Please speak up.
Yeah, I'm from Institutional Investor Magazine. My question is to Dr. Frenkel. Dr. Stiglitz was extremely scathing about the international financial elite being at the cause of the crisis, lack of reform being at the cause of not solving the crisis. Considering that in your current role, you're chairman of one of the largest global financial institutions, I was wondering what you think of that indictment and how do you like to do better?
Okay. Thank you. We have the usual mix of wonderful questions that give you a flavor for our diverse audience. With that, may I invite first Joe to lead us off, and then Jacob, and then Xiumin.
Okay, well, let me just pick out a couple of the questions. On the question about the risk of the weak dollar, or dollar getting weaker, I mean, I think the first point to observe is that the exchange rates always are going to have to be adjusting. One of the fundamental problems, I think, is that the dollar as a reserve currency is an anachronism in a global economy of the 21st century. And that has, in some sense, artificially inflated the dollar relative to what it should be. And so in my mind, the natural pattern will be for a still weaker dollar. The Secretaries of Treasury and Chairman of the Federal Reserve have to make a statement that they believe in the strong dollar. And I can't help but talk a story when I was Chairman of the Council. We were trying to both increase exports, obviously, and the Treasury Secretary was always talking about the value, the belief in the strong dollar. And I said, how do you reconcile these two? And of course, he had no good answer, except that maybe demand curves were upward sloping rather than downward sloping. This is the sort of the dilemma of the rhetoric that we've gotten ourselves into. What is of concern is sudden changes in exchange rates, because that could be very disruptive, probably because it have asset price effects on asset prices and ability to repay loans and so forth. So I think, and the final point I want to make is something actually Jacob said. The real point here is to try, the exchange rate with China, which is obviously a very contentious issue, is not the key issue in the trade global imbalances. And that the best way of solving that problem is, again, to do what I emphasize, get the economy, the global economy growing, the U.S. economy growing. If the world were growing more rapidly, the U.S. and Europe were growing, then I think the ability to make the adjustments in exchange rate would be much easier. People don't want to adjust when they see the cost will be higher unemployment. Let me talk the Greek problem or Ireland problem. I like to talk about Ireland better because that was a real case of mismanagement. That is to say, the government let the bubble grow, and then after the bubble broke and the banking system was falling apart, the government guaranteed all the bondholders and basically put on the shoulders of the Irish people for generations this burden of debt. Iceland took a very different course, and Iceland is recovering. Its unemployment rate, contrast the number, unemployment is down to about between 8 and 9%. So that gives you an example of the virtue of restructuring, in effect. Greece is a particular difficult problem. They inherited a lot of problems from a previous government. The current government inherited a lot of problems from the previous government. The previous government had not been transparent. The current government, I think, has done, I feel very close to the current government, so maybe you have to take that into account, but I think they've done everything basically right. I mean, there's no perfection in this world, but made the right political judgments. But as the numbers that Jacob showed, the debts are continuing to increase. And as I made in my remarks, the solution that will almost inevitable, will have to happen eventually, probably, but we don't know, is restructuring. The delicate issue here is always the following. You're never sure. And the cost of restructurings often are disruptive. Let me give you two stories, two examples.
Could we? I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt you.
Let me.
But
anyway,
one story.
Brazil decided not to restructure, and today is in very good shape. Argentina decided to restructure, faced a very painful transition, but now is also in good shape. So there was two answers, two different situations. They went through a very difficult period, which I could understand no country wanting to go through, but there's life after restructuring. And, but they had one other advantage. They changed the exchange rate.
Thank you very much.
I'll try to be brief and collect some of the questions together. First, the issue of exchange rates. We already discussed that exchange rate alone does not do the job. It can accompany a broader package. But we need to also ask, why is it the case that people and countries are concerned about an exchange rate that is moving, nominal exchange rate, is it moving high or down? I'm not talking about the volatility, I'm talking about the level. The reason is that there are a lot of rigidities in the economic system, that if there were no such rigidities, then the homogeneity postulate would have worked and a nominal price goes up and it doesn't affect relative prices and everything would have been lovely. I'm not trying to sound naive, but I want to come again to say that time and again, many of the problems that arise in the nominal system reflect the rigidities in the economy and the lack of attention that is given to structural measures. And that's a very important point. And structural measures are not politically attractive because you do the hard work today and the benefits are diffused over time and they are not happening. So since you have been here so quiet for so long, I'll tell you a quick story about Mendes France. Mendes France in France, when he was the head of France, wanted to convince his people to stop drinking alcohol. And it was not easy. So in every metro station, he put a sign, "Stop drinking alcohol, it will kill you slowly." And somebody added a note underneath it saying, "That's okay, we are not in a hurry." And when it comes to structural measures, one needs to be in a hurry. And I think that if we were putting more attention on this, the questions of protectionism and the question of the real consequences of nominal changes would have been less dramatic. Two telegraphic remarks about regulation. I think that first of all, there is good regulation and bad regulation. There is good deregulation and bad deregulation. But as we look at the most recent crisis, I think that a lot of focus in the public debate and in the legislation was about regulation and more regulation. I think we need to examine again the question of the enforcement of the old regulations. Has the supervisory authorities been firm enough to implement what the regulations actually require them to implement? And if one of the problems was on the supervisory side, then the haste into more regulation will not solve the problem, because if they are not being implemented anyhow. So I think that there is a lot to say about the supervision. About the intra-regional trade, it is connected to the protectionism. As a general rule, when one discusses custom unions, one always has to balance off the implications of trade creation and trade diversion. Is a custom union something that is protectionist, or is it opening up? Well, it's opening up within the union, and it is somewhat protectionist between the union and the rest, and one needs to balance off. So the issue of intra-regional trade agreements, I have nothing to worry about it much, as long as it is not at the expense of a globally open trading system, because that's where the key benefit to the world will come. On the institutional investor question, I don't want to say that one is saved by the bell, because we do not have time, but I do want to say that there is no question that that a lot of improvements were called for. Quite a few are in place, but it is also important to note that the question of unintended consequences of well-intentioned policy measures has to be taken seriously. I'm very concerned, for example, about that the outcome of all of this will not end up with breaking the level playing field. The US is doing its activities, Europe is doing its activities, Asia is doing its activities, and each one taken separately may find the right optimal outcome. It's very important that at the end of the day, the field is leveled, and we will not have the distortive regulatory arbitrage that may arise. I can say a lot about GC fees. Some of you do not know what GC fees are. SIFI is systemically important financial institutions. G-SIFIs is globally systemically important financial institutions. And it's a very attractive name for those who impose greater levies and greater things than the too large to fail. Too large to fail should not be used as an excuse to prevent failure. It should be an agenda to ensure that there is orderly exit of those who failed. It means much effort into resolution authorities. We should not forget that size and economies of scale and scope have a lot of benefits to it also. So if something is large, the fact that you dissect it into small units does not mean that you have a safer system. You may have actually a less safe system. So like always, common sense must prevail. And common sense, the greatest enemy of it is haste.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be very quick. I will start with dollar issues and with global cooperation. The dollar. Let me continue your story. 30 years ago, the dollar became really weak. So there's a huge concern about how to preserve the value of the dollar. From where? From Europeans. Because at that time, Europeans are the major dollar holders. So that's what G5 tried to think about. How do we maintain the dollar value? That's SDR, and we call it substitute account. You may know that at that time. And the American at that time, 30 years ago, also realized it's important to have a stabilized value of the reserve currency, and also you just don't want this exchange rate policy and sort of manage it in the hands of the others. So American also showed a cooperative attitudes. So that's working there. One thing changed. When Paul Volcker took the seats of chairman of the Fed, 1 year later, he raised interest rates. The dollar became ever strong. The issue is gone. So the whole thing is gone. Now, 30 years later today, and to preserve the value of the reserve currency once again become very important issues. I think the good news is both sides realize, the holder side and issue side, the US and all the others have realized it's very important to working together. So that's the reason when the French take the presidency of the G20, they decide to put international monetary system reform on the top. Among them, how to preserve the value of the currency become the key issue. And also liquidity issue, another gentleman mentioned, is also important. Dollar accounts 62% of global reserve, but dollar accounts 76% of global liquidity. So that's the reason dollar is almost irreplaceable today. It's rather on the liquidity side, more rather than on the reserve side. And obviously, the liquidity very much subject to one sovereign domestic policy. So how does this make liquidity, global liquidity management in a much more multinational framework is also the part of the issue. And the trade, I agree with you, trade will be much more diversified in the next 10 years. And also the financial flow as well. In terms of global cooperation, I think the good news is, everyone realizes we are living in such globalized, interconnected world. We have to work together. And so that's the reason you will see the G20 put a very challenging task of the international monetary system reform on the table. And actually, we have been working hard and reached a lot of common ground. So I will say the international cooperation still daunting challenges, but it's moving in the right direction. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we do have to end here despite our desire to go on and on with this fascinating discussion. Please excuse us while we dash out. I'm sure many of you will want to speak with our speakers, but we do have to go. And please join me in thanking our extraordinary panel.